forget how amazing it is. Okay. So I think we were starting in the Likutim, but the halacha that we're studying actually, we had just finished. I think we're up to Sif Yud Beis. Let's take a look. B'chol shtar sheyesh bo kinyan, bein shtar chov, bein shtar mechira o matana, that any shtar that records a kinyan in it, that records or that is accompanied with a kinyan, whether it's a promissory note, that sort of is a record of a loan that's made, or whether it's a shtar mechira, whether it's a bill of sale, okay, or a bill of gift. Let's say a gift is given, and along with the gift comes a piece of paper that says that's on such and such a date, such and such a person hereby granted as a gift a piece of real estate to Plony. The yeshbo tanai the asmachta. But what if that bill of that piece of paper contains a tanai, some kind of condition or stipulation, or an asmachta? We're going to learn what an asmachta is, that it involves some kind of condition. And we'll see how it's different from the word tanai. We're going to look in the commentary shortly, and we'll take a look. No, asmachta means, I would guess the way to translate it would be reliance. Oh, I see. Yeah, it's the same word in asmachta. The word asmachta, when it's used in the Talmud, is a biblical source for a rabbinic law. A biblical source for a rabbinic law, which sounds like it's an oxymoron, but it's not. Essentially, what sometimes the Gemara will do is it'll say, even though this pasuk was cited as a source for this law, it's really a rabbinic law, the asmachtahi, and it is the biblical verse is really just an asmachta, and what that word means, it's a reliance. It means the same thing. It means the same thing, but what it really means is that the pasuk is not the source, meaning that was not God's intent when he wrote the pasuk. And there was never an intent for that to be a mitzvah, the way that the rabbis extracted a mitzvah from it. But rather, the rabbis invented this halacha because they felt that they needed to create a fence around the Torah, or whatever reason it is. And in order to bolster the strength of this rabbinic enactment, they pointed to a pasuk which they feel contains the same theme as the rabbinic law, or something that hints to the rabbinic law. Even. Yeah, so it anchors it onto a pasuk, even though that was not the original intent of the pasuk. The pasuk was not meant to enact that law. The rabbis enacted it, and then they anchored it to a pasuk that doesn't mean that, but that you could read the pasuk in such a way that you could infer that law. Okay, so so the Rav Shulchan Aruch actually explains. He says, "What is Tanai v'asmachta? She someches daito shelo yiskayim hatanai." In this context, the term asmachta means that I'm giving this to you with a piece of paper, but contained in the piece of paper is a conditional statement that shesomeches daito, that I rely on the fact shelo yitkayem hatanai, that the condition will never be fulfilled. Okay, velo haya hakinyan klum. And so based on that asmachta that is inside the piece of paper. So we'll give some examples, but let's just a simple, I hereby am giving you this piece of real estate on the condition that you can jump to the moon. Okay, on the condition that you can jump to the moon. Now, that obviously is not meant to be taken seriously, because who can jump to the moon? Well, if you made that deal with Elon Musk, he might say, well, I can jump to the moon in my Tesla X, what is it called? This not Tesla X, something X, SpaceX. With my SpaceX rocket, I will jump to the moon and I can fulfill it, right? But that's not what the expectation of the giver is, the gifter is. V'lo haya kinyan klum. So it turns out that whatever kinyan was made, even though there was an exchange of paper, but since contained in the paper was such an outlandish kind of condition that there was no expectation of the fulfillment of that condition, v'nimtza shelo gomar v'hikna. So it turns out that the giver or the seller never thought that he really did not intend for the transaction to take place. V'lachein af im yiskayem hatanai ein hakinyan moil, and therefore, even if the buyer or the recipient is able to fulfill that outlandish condition, the kinyan is not considered to be effective, ela imkain kanu miyado bifnei beistin chashuv, unless a full beistin was assembled, and not just any old beistin of three guys, but a chashuv beistin, which means a beistin of established rabbanim in the community gathered together, because then there's an assumption that this is serious. No one's going to assemble a beistin chashuv if there was never any intention for the deal to be consummated. The fact that now we've assembled a beistin chashuv, even though the Tanai seems outlandish, but it's clear that it's meant to be taken seriously. Sha'az gomar v'hikna, because then we assume that the giver or the seller did have serious intent. Oh, afilu lo kanu mimenu bifnei beistin, ela shetziva lichtov b'shtar shekanu mimenu bebeistin chashuv. As an alternative, if the giver or the seller says, we don't need to assemble a group of three rabbanim, but I want you to record in the shtar, I want you to write in the shtar that this kinyan was made in the presence of a beistin chashuv, even though it's not true. But he says, but record that in the shtar, or that the kinyan was made in front of a beistin chashuv. So then he means for it to be taken seriously. Va'af al pi shehu sheker, even though it's not true. And the reason why that piece of paper is now legally binding is hodas baldin kimeya edim, because the acknowledgement of a litigant is like 100 witnesses. That this is a statement that's made by the Gemara. When a litigant himself says, yes, I owe the money, or yes, I made the kinyan, then even if 100 witnesses try to contradict that, since he's creating a liability for himself, his word is taken as truth, even if it never happened. Even if it never happened, but the fact that he says, I gave this property to this guy, his word is halachically binding. So therefore, even if it wasn't done in front of a beistin chashuv, we interpret the statement in the shtar to mean that I want this contract, I want this paper to be as binding as if it was done in front of a beistin chashuv. Shegomar v'hikna, that he really did seriously commit himself to the transaction. Oh, an alternative, shetziva lichtov shekibel alav becherem o bishvua. Another alternative text he could write is that I hereby accept upon myself that on the condition that you jump to the moon, or, maybe it's something that he really could fulfill, but it's still a little bit outlandish, that you're going to sit and learn for 10 years, right? And then the guy actually does sit and learn for 10 years, so that you're going to finish Shas or whatever it is. And the guy finishes Shas. And he accepts it upon himself, becherem o bishvua, accepting upon himself either that I should be placed under ban if I don't accept this, or if I don't fulfill this transaction, or that I hereby accept upon myself the stringency of a shvuah, of an oath, right, that should be bound to this transaction. Shehein moilos afilu ba'asmachta. That in all of these situations, even when you write an outlandish condition, the transaction is legally binding. Kishemitzaveh lichtov kain, gomar vehikna. So when you write it in that way, then we know that the person who's making the transaction is fully serious about the transaction and has in mind that the transaction should be consummated. Afal pi shelo kibel alav, even though even though he doesn't really accept upon himself a shavua and doesn't accept upon himself a cherem, but when he writes it in that, when he writes that in the shtar, he's giving the shtar that power. But the witnesses who are drafting the transactional papers have to be very careful not to write those words until they actually receive that permission to write it, because sometimes people would write up standard texts of a shtar, right, based upon other texts that they had read about, where all of these things are included in order to guarantee the transaction. And the fact is that maybe the guy who's making this transaction doesn't mean for it to be legally binding in that way. Let's see. Until the person who is binding himself really is serious about it. This is a very long halacha. Mm-hmm. It is, but what if there's a condition that's made with the kinyan? What overrides what? Yes, it's a good question. What overrides the kinyan in this case is where there is such an outlandish condition placed upon the transaction that it's reasonable to interpret that the guy is going through some kind of elaborate ruse, for a practical joke, because he doesn't mean it seriously. He's playing a practical joke. Yeah, you're going to finish Shas. You know what? I'll give you my house if you finish Shas, right? The guy says, you ready to make a kinyan on it? Sure. Makes a kinyan in front of two witnesses. Okay, draw up the papers, guys. Okay, because he thinks the whole thing is absurd. You going to finish Shas? He forgot that there's art scroll. He forgot, that he forgot that there's a way to get it done, right? There's like, listen, when 25 years ago, if someone would have said to you, I want you to finish Shas, you would have laughed at them in the face, right? He finished the entire Talmud Bavli. Now you could finish not only Bavli, but Yerushalmi. Piece of cake, right? Multiple cycles. You just, you got your art scroll, you got your podcast, you got this rabbi and that rabbi online. Easy to finish Shas. It's easy. So little did the fellow know, but it's what we call an asmachta. It's where we interpret that when he made the conditional statement, he wasn't serious. Because he never expected in his wildest dreams that this guy would finish Shas, or that he would do something else that's a major accomplishment. Just shows you how much we've advanced in such a short period of time.
He says, no, I'll do it. And then he takes an oath. He will.
No, we're not talking about an oath. No. Doug is asking about the first case. Doug, okay. Okay. The second part of this halacha. The second part of this halacha is that there are ways to override the outlandishness of this transaction when the guy does something that is really serious to demonstrate that he doesn't mean to be, this is not a practical joke, that this is serious. So there are a number of ways that the Rav Shulchan Aruch said that you can do that. Number one, you can assemble a beis din chashuv. Not just three guys. Number two, you can even just write in the shtar that it was done in the presence of a beis din chashuv, or you can write in the shtar that the person making the transaction commits himself to the power of a shavua. Right? Okay. So when you write certain language in the shtar, you're demonstrating that this is, despite the outlandish condition that, that one could interpret that it wasn't meant seriously. No, this text indicates that it was meant seriously. Then the transaction is binding. Yeah. Of a low bistam kinyan. But you can't just base it on the fact that just the kinyan was made. Like Doug was saying, Doug said, well, we learned that kinyan is the gold standard, right, in front of witnesses. Well, here's something that even will say will upend a kinyan. Yeah, we'll trump the kinyan of efficacy because it wasn't meant seriously. Okay, so before we go any further, this is a long halacha. Let's see, it extends. Oh, I got to get you. We won't even be able to finish the halacha because I got it. We're on page 20 already. Look at that. I got to send you the next packet. But let's go back to the Imrei Yaakov. And let's get started on the commentary for this halacha. Okay. Wow. This is really a lengthy. Okay. V'chol shtar sheyesh bo kinyan, bein shtar chov, bein shtar mechira o matana, v'yesh bo tanai v'asmachta. Okay. So going back to the original line, any contract that represents a transaction, whether it's a promissory note or whether it's a gift or a sale, a bill of sale, but it contains within it a conditional statement that seems outlandish. So let's take a look at the Imrei Yaakov. Shtar sheyesh bo kinyan, perish afilu im asa kinyan al ze miyad. That is to say that even though a physical kinyan was done with the transfer of this piece of paper, bikol makom ho'il v'gila daito sheker kavanoso enu kidei lahaknoso. He says, but since by placing this condition in the shtar, he has the person making the transaction has revealed that he doesn't really mean for the kinyan to be a transaction. Ella sheyekuyam tano nechshav zela asmachto. He only wants his tanai to be fulfilled, but does not have in mind for the transaction to take place. This is considered to be an asmachta, and we'll explain this more as we go along. The yeshbo tanai v'asmachta, din asmachta de lokanya, das habach de einze elamidurabanan, abol min haTorah asmachta kanya. The Gemara makes a statement, asmachta lo kanya, that when an outlandish condition is placed in a transactional paper, it is not, the transaction is null and void. But the Bach commentary on the Torah is of the opinion that the fact that it is not, the transaction is null, that's only a rabbinic law. But biblically, the transaction is binding. The Hashach of the Dvar of Temuim Ayin Sham. The Shach disagrees. He says no. When there's an asmachta in a shtar, even midioraisa, there's no legal standing for that transaction. Tanai. So there's a condition put in. Kol hatanoim yalfinan mitnai devinei gad ureuven. This is a Gemara in Kiddushin, which basically tells us that first of all, the laws of Tanai, the laws of how to make a legally binding condition in a transaction, are learned out from the Torah passages in Parshas Matos that deal with the story of Moshe granting the real estate on the eastern side of the Jordan, Transjordan, to the tribes of Gad and Reuven. If you recall that story, Moshe said, if you come in and fight with us, then you will get the Transjordan. But if you don't come over and fight with us, then you will not get the Transjordans. That's one of the things we learn, is that for a conditional statement to be valid, it has to go on both sides. If A, then B. If not A, then not B. Okay? But he says, "V'alfinan misham deboinan sheyat tanai kaful." That's what in Hebrew is called the tanai kaful, a doubled conditional statement. If A, then B. If not A, then not B. Vehain kodem lalav, and the positive has to precede the negative. Right? You can't say if not A, then not B, but if A, then B. You have to say if A, then B, and if not A, then not B second. Utanai kodem lamaisa, and furthermore, the condition has to be before the action. So that you have to say, if you cross into the Jordan, if you cross in and fight, then we will give you the Transjordan. Not, we will give you the Transjordan if you come in with us and fight. No, you have to put the conditional part first, and then the product of that condition second. I'm sure this is probably part of secular law as well. There's got to be some kind of structure to it. Furthermore, the Tanai has to involve something completely different from the action that is being granted. So going into fight is completely different from receiving the parcel in the Transjordan. There's nothing having to do with the Transjordan that is part of the conditional statement. Yeah. Yes, it does imply. It does imply. So the question then is, open up Parshas Matos. Why then did Moshe have to say it? Right. Right. So what we learn from there is that there's a proper mechanism for binding a transaction to a tanai, to a condition. If you don't do it in the way that it's structured, the argument could be made that the transaction is binding even when the condition is not fulfilled. Okay. Furthermore, the condition has to be something that is practically doable. Okay. So in other words, it has to be something that is possible for the other side to actually fulfill. Okay, and otherwise the whole transaction is thrown out the window. And that which you need to have a doubled tanai, if A then B, if not A then not B, hani mili bikarkos. This only applies to real estate. Avol b'metaltalin nohagin achshav delo ba'inan tanai kafel. When it comes to the transactional exchange of chattel, our minhag today is that to not require a double statement. If A, then B, if not A, then not B. But all you need is if A, then B. It seems that way. It seems that way, but its language seems to imply that this became the accepted norm over the course of time. I don't know. Half of Menashe.
That stipulation not apply to them because they were not part of that.
That's an interesting question. Where does the half tribe of Menashe come into play in all of this?
In other words, do they have a deal on it? I don't know. I don't remember it.
I don't know, but it could be that they had to comply with the conditions also. Somehow later on in the story, they were inserted in the deal. And whether or not they were bound to the conditional statement of having to fight, it's not clear from the text. Well, I've given a lot of exposition and sermonics on that topic, but as far as the straight halacha, it's not clear from the psukim why Moshe did it. Okay, now in the footnote, just to answer Paul's question, he says, "Denoagin b'chol batei dinim b'Yisrael ladin kein she b'metaltalin loboi dinei tanai mishum takonas hashuk." Batei din today do not require the stringencies of the structure of the tanai, the way we're saying it now, for chattel because of takonas hashuk, because otherwise this would create turbulence or instability in the marketplace exchanges. In other words, when it comes to quick purchases and sales, we have to be more concise in the way that we allow deals to be consummated. So if there is going to be a condition placed upon a sale, we don't require it to be a Tanai kafel with all of the other stipulations. But then he says, about Tanai she'ef shalakaima lo habi Tanai gam b'metaltalin. But if it's an outlandish Tanai that that's not really reasonable to expect the guy to fulfill, so then the even with chattel, that's not a binding transaction. Im Omar shemasna kitanai b'nei Gad u'b'nei Ruvain o ketikun Chazal mahani below dinei Tanai. Now, what if a person simply says, I am making this transaction on the condition of such and such, and I want it to be legally binding like the condition of B'nai Gad and B'nai Ruvain. So you want to just abbreviate everything. So you cover all your bases and say, I want it to work like the way that Moshe made it tonight with Gad and Ruvain, or the way Chazal require it tonight. So then that actually helps. And he says, there's a sefer called Divrei Gaonim Sheherich B'inyanim Elu, who goes into great extent in explaining how to draft the Tanai properly. All right, so we'll hold it here for today, and Mir Hashem will continue.